Good afternoon, everyone. It is November 14th, and this is part two of my discussion on the meeting that is taking place between President Biden and Xi Jinping of China tomorrow. The last video I made focused on trade issues, so if you didn't see that one, please go take a look at it. It's pretty extensive. In fact, I ran it right up into the 10-minute mark. But this one specifically focuses on global security and defense and the discussions that will take place between President Biden and Xi Jinping. So obviously the big discussion between China and the US will be the strategic competition and global security concerns, as both countries seem to be separating themselves on the global stage as military powers. China still has a lot of catching up to do with regard to the United States and its expeditionary power, but China is also separating itself. I still think it has even some catch up to do in its naval capacity with regard to even Japan. But nonetheless, this is an area where both the US and China have concerns. Now, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee has highlighted the strategic competition with China, including China's reaction to Russia's aggression in Ukraine and its involvement in global security, as a challenge going forward. This includes scrutiny of Chinese companies providing support to Russia and the need for multilateral partnerships to counter Chinese Communist Party activities. Both the U.S. and China have been focusing on military modernization and capability enhancement. China is increasing military expenditure and advancement in such areas as missile technology, cyber capabilities, and naval power, especially in the South China Sea, and that's raised concerns in the U.S. and its allies in the region and globally. Now, China's official military budget is $225 billion, but due to hidden spending and a broader coverage of where military money goes, it is likely closer to $700 billion. This is compared to the U.S. at $816 billion. However, it's worth noting a couple of things here. China's budget only recently reached the superpower levels. A better discussion is to look at the cumulative spending over 20 years, because that is the life cycle of equipment and R&D and soldiers, which the U.S. has dominated spending over 20-year period, well outpacing China over that period. So even though China is catching up right now, over time, the U.S. still has a pretty significant cumulative advantage. China also spends a large portion of its military on domestic military control of its population. So even with this buildup, even with the increase in spending, there's really no indication China is preparing for an invasion of Taiwan or even preparing a planned direct conflict with the United States. It's like the United States in that the U.S. continues to bolster its capability in order to be ready to react. The Chinese are doing the same thing. This would be like thinking the U.S. is preparing for an invasion of one of its neighbors because it has a large military budget. It's just not true. And the fact of the matter is, China is likely not going to be invading Taiwan anytime soon. China, however, is concerned with the accelerated pace with which the U.S. is gaining stronger allied ties in China's backyard. This includes Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam. Indonesia is of particular concern for China because it grants the U.S. the ability to close the Strait of Malacca, which would be devastating for Chinese energy imports. Since North Korea is mostly inept and Russia is clearly preoccupied and weaker than previously thought, China now realizes it's largely alone in its security and thus trying to play catch up with the U.S. China has only one formal military treaty, and that is with North Korea. Meanwhile, the U.S. has many treaties with countries near China. Nonetheless, this military buildup by China is nothing that is going to signal any type of war anytime soon, but it is definitely in an effort to counter U.S. power in the region. And the intentions of China with this buildup will likely be discussed between Xi Jinping and President Biden. Obviously, a big elephant in the room that's going to be talked about is Taiwan. The situation concerning Taiwan, particularly in the context of the heightened tensions that we've seen between China and the U.S., is expected to be very much at the forefront. Biden will reaffirm the U.S. stance of maintaining the status quo under the One China policy while recognizing Beijing as the government of China and maintaining non-diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but also reaffirming to China the U.S. commitment to Taiwanese security as a matter of national interest to the U.S. and its global partners. Between the two leaders, there is a pretty well-known understanding that taking Taiwan by force is an extraordinarily difficult prospect for China. However, China is going to seek assurances from the U.S., and the U.S. is likely going to give them that the U.S. is not seeking to completely divorce Taiwan from China, creating an independent Taiwan. Now, with regard to Russia, President Biden is likely to reiterate that violation of the sanctions regime against Russia by China would elicit an immediate economic response against China. Given China's current economic difficulties, this is something that China doesn't want, and China's really seeking to warm relations with the United States and the European countries in the face of faltering economic problems and Russia really being weaker than expected. China has cooled to Russia in recent months, but continues its tacit support of Putin's regime, even while quietly disagreeing with its efforts in Ukraine. Additionally, President Biden is likely to implore Xi Jinping to press Vladimir Putin to end his war in Ukraine and rein in North Korea with regard to supplying munitions to Russia, as well as ballistic missile and potential nuclear testing. Additionally, Biden is expected to discuss China's influence over Iran, urging it to ensure that Tehran or its proxies do not escalate the conflict in the Middle East, specifically talking about Hezbollah, surrounding this Israel-Hamas war. China will probably discuss the same with regard to U.S. influence in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, etc. They might also address recent issues that have strained the relationship between the two countries, like the balloon incident, China's belligerence in the South China Sea, the U.S. freedom of navigation efforts near Taiwan, sales of weapons to Taiwan, new export controls on advanced technology, and China's reaction to the visit by Taiwanese president to the U.S. back in April. But they also may choose to ignore these hot button issues from the past because they may see it as potentially souring any future relations, and they don't want to do that. Overall, I expect the meeting to warm relations between the U.S. and China. I think that it might escalate the relations, and we might be in a better place after this meeting than we were before, even if it's not as super productive as we had all hoped in meeting certain goals. But the fact that they're talking, the fact that there's going to be discussion, that's going to make relations better. We will likely see the standard readouts from both countries on how the U.S. and China will maintain open lines of communication and manage competition responsibly, and especially in areas where the interests of both nations align. They may discuss future partnerships economically with various declarations. They'll express their continued commitment to nuclear and space domain assurances in the face of really both countries modernizing their arsenals. But the more controversial stuff will likely remain behind closed doors, as both countries will want to present a path to more friendly relations. And frankly, that's what I think we're going to see. I'm not saying it's going to be a big nothing burger. I definitely think that there will be progress made in certain areas, but whatever comes to the forefront to the general public, whether it's discussion in the trade, as I talked about in my previous video, or within military space, most of the hard-hitting stuff is going to stay outside of the public eye, at least in the immediate terms. We may see the results come to fruition over time, but for now, I think that this is more of both countries trying to just reestablish warm relations, trying to get back in the saddle of discussion and moving forward with what has been essentially a couple years of strained relations between the U.S. and China, something that China really wants to overcome and really the U.S. as well, because both countries are significantly tied economically. And we'll see what happens. Tomorrow is when they meet, and potentially, depending on what comes out, if there isn't just some vague readout, if we do see some stuff, I might discuss it. But other than that, have a good day, everyone.